Yeehaw everyone, and welcome to another video. Now, I have long awaited the release of Rockstar's latest masterpiece, Red Dead Redemption 2, on PC, and I'm finally glad I get to experience it at 4K with 60 frames per second. Only joking, because today we're going to be attempting to run it on this, the cheapest in AMD's current APU lineup, the Athlon 200GE. It has 2 cores, 4 threads, and integrated Vega 3 graphics. Saddle up, partner, because we are in for a pretty bumpy trek down the low-end hardware trail. So, cowboys and cowgirls, the first thing to do for the best chance of success with the Athlon 200GE was to overclock it to 3.9 GHz. Now, this can be done in the BIOS by adjusting the CPU clock ratio. This is probably as far as it will go here. I have read, I believe, some success stories of just over 4 GHz, but considering this isn't supposed to be an overclockable chip anyway, I think 3.9 is pretty good. It may make a tiny bit of difference in the game, but well, we'll just have to see. Double checking our new speed in CPU-Z as well as the RAM speed here. 3200 MHz, 16 gigs of which we are using, again for the best chance of success, and it was time to attempt to launch Red Dead Redemption 2. I've heard a few problems can occur when using Rockstar's game launcher, but it seems that everything got off to a pretty smooth start. So here we are at the game's starting menu here. We're going to jump straight into the settings, go straight to the graphics options here, and pretty much turn everything down to low. Now we can go to 1024x768, but for the purpose of maintaining the aspect ratio, I decided to stick with 1280x720. I then turned everything else down to low or off, including VSync, triple buffering, mirror quality was on low, texture quality was on low, everything you can think of including the TAA, FXAA and MSAA was either on low or off, depending on how low I could actually turn it down to. There was one setting at the bottom here, fur quality, which only let us choose between medium and high for some reason, so medium it was. With these settings adjusted, it was time to test the in-game benchmark. Now, as the benchmark kicks off here, I know what you're thinking, this is an unsalvageable experience. As you can see from the benchmark test, which was completed using the Vulkan API, as it seemed to give me 1 more frame per second than DX12, it's remaining pretty much around 20 FPS. I think the average at the end of this run was actually 20 or 21, but don't worry because there are a couple of other settings we can mess around with in order to get playable frame rates. Well, we're going to be targeting 30 here, as 60 is simply out of the question unless we were to perhaps open the INI file and drop the resolution down to something ridiculous like 360 by 240, should it allow that. Now I'm going to skip ahead in the benchmark run to the town of Saint Denis here. Now this is probably going to be one of the more intensive in-game areas, a hustling, bustling city with plenty of people around, plenty of buildings, and a lot going on screen. You can see here though that the frame rate sort of hovered around that 20 mark yet again, and as the action started to heat up during this benchmark run, well, we weren't seeing too many stutters, things like that. It was just a generally all-round low frame rate. The 200GE, the CPU part of which was hovering around 50% usage, but the Vega iGPU, well, that was maxing out at 100% a lot of the time. Here's a quick look at the results. 19 was in fact the average result at the end of the benchmark run there. But what we can do in order to try and squeeze a few more frames out of our Athlon here is actually mess around with the resolution scale. You can either set this lower than full screen resolution, or you can set it higher up to 2.5 times the native resolution of the game if you like to suffer in terms of your on-screen frame rates. I actually dropped this down to 50% of 720p just to try and squeeze those few extra frames out of it, and here is what happened. Now, I mentioned before that Saint Denis was a particularly demanding place, but it seems as though that is equalled by the snowy areas, especially with the blizzard occurring on screen. This is actually in fact a little more demanding when I think about it, as I did play through the opening mission as well, and we'll get onto that in a little bit, but you will have a little bit of trouble with the 200GE. It's really no surprise. This was more of a curiosity test more than anything else. It's probably not advisable to build a PC especially for Red Dead Redemption featuring this chip, but if you've got it in an HTPC, a small form factor build, something like that, you want to fire this game up, just know that you can probably do so if you're willing to sacrifice pretty much every single aspect of the graphical quality here. As you can see, the little crime spree in Saint Denis here toward the end of the benchmark ended quite well. Things were running fairly smoothly. The game looks absolutely horrendous, but it's nice that Rockstar includes so many graphical options so that us low-end gamers can really make the most out of this title. If you want to tweak it so it looks similar to this, but you're happy with the end result, Rockstar give you that option to do so. I know for 99% of people this probably isn't going to be acceptable, but as I said before, if you've got low-end hardware and it's more powerful than the 200GE, well, you are in for a fair chance at running this title, even if you do have to turn things way down. The end result here was something like 33 frames per second on average. Now the opening few sequences of the game are very dark, so I apologise if you can't see much on screen here. This particular scene is quite intensive on our 200GE here. We're averaging around 25 frames per second during this sequence. So I want to move on here to a shootout pretty early on in the game at the Adler Ranch. The frame rate seemed to stabilise. We were averaging once again around 30 FPS. I chose this particular mission not only because it's very early on in the game, but because it seems to be a pretty demanding task here on our little graphics chip. I said before that the snowy areas can impact the frame rate the most on lower end hardware. As you can see here, interior scenes will give you a nice little boost in frame rate as well, sometimes shooting up to the low 50s, which is a nice touch. You actually spend a lot more time inside buildings than you think you're going to in Red Dead Redemption 2, so I guess that counts for something. Okay, so now I kept the Athlon 200GE in the system, but I also added this to the equation, my 4GB RX 570. A pretty budget-friendly graphics card that doesn't cost too much and should be able to give you a decent gaming experience across a lot of titles. Here in Red Dead Redemption 2, I decided to set everything to medium at 1080p resolution this time, with resolution scaling off. So we were running at Full HD, 1080p, no compromises, with the medium settings, and as you can see here, this improved the game by quite some margin. Focusing on that Saint Denis scene in particular here, and yeah, as you would expect, the CPU quickly became the limiting factor, but that's not to say that the GPU doesn't hit 100% usage at some points, leaving the CPU wondering what on earth is going on. It seems to have a little more to give in some scenarios and totally gives up in other parts of the title. We also experienced a couple of freezes here, solid freezes that were probably the result of the dual-core Athlon itself, but overall 47 FPS was the average at medium, and that's the setting that I probably advise you play Red Dead Redemption 2 with if you have a similar CPU and GPU combination. I wouldn't recommend using this processor to play the game, but as I said before, it's nice to know that you can if you really want to, and even if you don't have a discrete graphics card to pair with it. Overall, this was simply a test of my curiosity. I don't really recommend playing on the 200GE. If you have it in your system and you're relying on the integrated Vega graphics, you can play at 30 frames per second, should you turn everything down to 720p low and turn that resolution scaling down to 50%. If you want to play it, and you have a 200GE as well as a discrete graphics card, you can probably bump things up to 1080p and retain at least 30 frames per second with a mixture of low, medium, and perhaps even some high settings thrown in. I think it's fantastic that even this, a $55 or £45 APU, can run Red Dead Redemption 2 with nothing but the onboard graphics. I think AMD have come very far in terms of how good their APUs are. I know the Ryzen APUs will probably fare quite a bit better than this, but I'm just thinking back to the days when the A4 3300 existed, for example. That would really suffer at the hands of a game like this. With all that said and done, well, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, leave a like on it. Let me know what hardware you're running Red Dead Redemption 2 on down below, whether you've had any graphical issues, launcher issues, stuff like that. Be sure to leave a dislike on this video if you didn't enjoy it. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, as I'd love to get to 300k before Christmas and bring you a delightful festive special. And hopefully I'll see all of you in the next one.